So we're now in the afterword of the book. I'm on page 275 if you have your book. There is a section before because the book ends on page 268, but it is how we got into, or how Europe got into World War II, and then what happened during World War II. And it's a very long section. You're welcome to read it, but we had watched a couple of videos before we started that gave us all the information about what the events that led up to Hitler being a leader in Germany. And then we know a lot about World War II and the systematic persecution of the Jews. So we're going to start on page 275, it's Roman numeral 2, and we'll read here to the end. You can look for the answers to the questions that you have on page 100. It wants to know what happened to their captors, who went to which concentration camps, what happened to Anne and Margot, and who survived. So let's start.
Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929, in the historic German city of Frankfurt. Frankfurt owed much of its commercial and cultural preeminence to its Jewish community, of which the Franks were members. The founders of the great Jewish banking family, the Rothschilds, had been natives of Frankfurt. Anna's father, Otto Frank, a respected businessman, could trace his family in the city's archives back to the 17th century. For Anna and her older sister Margot, the world of early childhood was a secure place, inhabited by loving parents, relatives, and nurses. Beyond the nursery, beyond the comfortable 5-room flat on Gang-Happerstrasse, the world was not so pleasant. Otto Frank did not wait for the full force of Nazi persecution to make itself felt. In the summer of 1933, the Franks left Frankfurt. Mrs. Frank, with the 2 girls, joined her mother in Aachen, near the Belgian border. Otto Frank went directly to Holland, where he established himself in a food products business. For centuries, Holland had provided a refuge for the persecuted. In the 1930s, it received many German Jews, as it had welcomed French Huguenots in the 16th century and English Puritans in the 17th. By the spring of 1934, the Franks were reunited and settled in Amsterdam. During the next few years, while crisis followed crisis, and the threat of a Second World War increased, Anne Frank lived happily in Amsterdam like any Dutch girl. She attended the Montessori school, had a host of friends, and discovered with delight that boys liked her. But all of this began to change once the Germans invaded Holland in 1940. Shortly after the invasion, Queen Wilhelmina and her cabinet escaped to England, where they formed a government in exile to cooperate with the Allies. Occupied Holland was ruled by a German High Commissioner, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who would one day be hanged as a major war criminal. The Germans terrorized and exploited Holland, as they did other conquered countries. They banned listening to Allied broadcasts, muzzled the press, and suppressed political parties and trade unions. They closed the universities and imprisoned the country's political, military, and intellectual leaders. Thousands of persons were sent to Germany as slave laborers. As the resistance movement grew stronger, the Germans exacted savage reprisals. In Holland, as elsewhere, they imposed harsh anti-Jewish measures. Despite strikes and protests by the brave Dutch, the roundup and deportation of Jews to extermination camps began. For Anne Frank, life under the German occupation was at first not greatly different from what it had been before. She was compelled to leave the Montessori school and to attend the Jewish Lyceum, but she still had her family and friends, and she was absorbed in the experiences of everyday life. The growing number of anti-Jewish decrees did not weigh heavily upon her. Her father, however, perceived the direction of events clearly enough. In February 1941, the Nazis launched their first roundup of Jews in Amsterdam. Those arrested were taken to reception camps at Westerbork and Wörth, and from there shipped eastward into Germany. As the roundups continued, Otto Frank made plans for his family's safety. He had been forced by a German decree to leave his business, but his Dutch associates and employees remained loyal friends. Secretly, a group of rooms at the top and back of a building on the Prinsengracht Canal, that served as a warehouse and office for the business, was prepared as a hiding place. On July 5, 1942, the Germans summoned 16-year-old Margot to report for deportation. The following morning, the Franks slipped away from their home and went into hiding in the secret annex. They were soon joined there by a business associate of Otto Frank, Mr. von Dahn, and by the latter's wife and 15-year-old son, Peter. Later, they invited an elderly dentist, Albert Jussel, to share their refuge. The 8 Jews in the secret annex remained quiet during the day while business was conducted as usual in the lower part of the building. They stirred only at night when the building was deserted. Their friends in the office below, Mr. Krupuis and Mr. Crawler, Miep van Santen and Ellie Volson, kept their secret, brought food and even gifts, provided what news they could of events in the city. That news, in the fall of 1942, was terrifying. The roundup and deportation of Jews from Holland was proceeding according to plan. When the Franks went into hiding, Germany was at the height of its conquests. Hitler's empire extended from the English Channel deep into Russia, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. Gradually, the tide began to turn. In the fall of 1942, the German advance into Russia was checked at Stalingrad. At the same time, in North Africa, the British drove the Germans back from Egypt, and with their French and American allies, the United States having entered the war in December 1941, landed in Morocco and Algeria behind the German forces. While the Russians counterattacked along the Eastern Front in 1943, the Western Allies cleared Africa of Hitler's Afrika Korps, conquered Sicily, and invaded Italy, toppling Hitler's fascist partner Benito Mussolini. Daily, Allied air raids over Europe grew in intensity. In June 1944 came the long-awaited Allied invasion of France. For 2 long years, the little group in the secret annex followed these events over their illegal radio. Joyfully, they looked forward to the day when the Germans would be driven from Holland and they could emerge from hiding. But on August 4, 1944, following information provided by a Dutch informer, the Gestapo penetrated into the Franks' hiding place. The 8 Jews, together with Mr. Krupuis and Mr. Crawler, were taken to Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam. After a few weeks' imprisonment, Mr. Krupuis was released for medical care. Mr. Crawler spent 8 months in a forced labor camp. The Franks, the von Dahns, and Mr. Jussel were sent to Westerbork. On September 3rd, the day the Allies captured Brussels, these 8 were among the last shipment of 1,000 Jews to leave Holland. The prisoners were herded aboard a freight train, 75 people to a car. The cars, each with only a small barred window high on one side, were sealed. For 3 days and nights the train wandered eastward across Germany, often stopping, backing, detouring. On the 3rd night, it reached Auschwitz in Poland. In the glare of searchlights, watched by black-uniformed SS men tightly reining their police dogs, the Jews left the train. On the platform, men and women were separated. It was the last Otto Frank saw of his family. At Auschwitz, the healthier prisoners, their heads shaved, worked 12 hours a day digging sod, driven relentlessly by the sadistic kapos, criminals who served the SS as labor overseers. At night they were locked into crowded barracks. Outside the windows they could see the sky glow red above the crematories. Through the research of Ernst Schnabel, a German writer whose book Anne Frank, A Portrait in Courage, was published in 1958, some of the events of the last few months of Anna's life have been reconstructed. Auschwitz, a former inmate told Mr. Schnabel, was fantastically well organized, spick and span hell. The food was bad, but it was distributed regularly. We kept our barracks so clean that you could have eaten off the floor. Anyone who died in the barracks was taken away first thing in the morning. Anyone who fell ill disappeared also. Those who were gassed did not scream, they were just no longer there. The crematory smoked, but we received our rations and had roll calls. The SS harassed us at roll call and kept guard with machine guns from the watchtowers, and the camp fences were charged with high-tension electricity, but we could wash every day and sometimes even take showers. If you could forget the gas chambers, you could manage to live. The prisoners moved like sleepwalkers, half dead, protected somehow from seeing anything, from feeling anything. But Anna had no such protection, another survivor recalled. I can still see her standing at the door and looking down the camp street as a herd of naked gypsy girls was driven by to the crematory, and Anna watched them go and cried. And she cried also when we marched past the Hungarian children, who had already been waiting half a day in the rain in front of the gas chambers, because it was not yet their turn. And Anna nudged me and said, "Look, look, their eyes." In October 1944, Anna, Margot, and Mrs. Von Don were among a group of the youngest and strongest women selected to be moved to Belsen in Germany. Left alone, refusing to eat, her mind wandering, Mrs. Frank died in the infirmary barracks at Auschwitz on January 6, 1945. Otto Frank, in the men's camp, saw Mr. Von Don taken off to be gassed. Mr. Dussel was sent back to Germany and died in the Neuenganger camp. When the SS abandoned Auschwitz in February 1945 to escape the advancing Russians, they took Peter Von Don with them on the winter march to the west. He was never heard from again. Otto Frank survived to be liberated by the Russians. Belsen, Anna discovered, was different from Auschwitz. There was no organization, no roll call, no food or water, only the barren, frozen heath and the starving people looking like ghosts. By January 1945, the Allies had reached the Rhine, but at Belsen typhus raged and hope was dead. At Belsen, Anna found her school friend, Lise Goossens. I waited, shivering in the darkness, Lise related of the night when Anna was brought to her. It took a long time, but suddenly I heard a voice. "Lise? Lise, where are you?" It was Anna, and I ran in the direction of the voice, and then I saw her beyond the barbed wire. She was in rags. I saw her emaciated, sunken face in the darkness. Her eyes were very large. We cried and cried, for now there was only the barbed wire between us, nothing more, and no longer any difference in our fates. I told Anna that my mother had died, and my father was dying, and Anna told me that she knew nothing about her father, but that her mother had stayed behind in Auschwitz. Only Margot was still with her, but she was already very sick. They had seen Mrs. Von Don again only after their arrival here in Belsen. Mrs. Von Don died at Belsen, but no witness marked the date. Margot died at the end of February or beginning of March 1945. Anna, who was already sick at the time, recalled the survivor, was not informed of her sister's death, but after a few days she sensed it, and soon afterwards she died, peacefully, feeling that nothing bad was happening to her. She was not yet 16.
3. In May 1945, the war ended. Months later, Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam by way of Odessa and Marseille. Miep and Ellie gave him the notebooks and papers in Anne's handwriting that they had found strewn over the floor of the secret annex after the Gestapo had gone. These were Anne's diary, stories, and sketches. They were all that remained. At first, Otto Frank had copies of the diary privately circulated as a memorial to his family. It was a Dutch university professor who urged formal publication of the book, and with only slight excisions by Mr. Frank, Het Achterhuis, the secret annex, was published in Amsterdam by Contact Publishers in June 1947. The book soon went through several editions. In 1950, it was published in Germany by the Heidelberg firm of Lambert Schneider. The first printing was only 4,500 copies, and many booksellers were actually afraid to show it in their windows. But the book caught on rapidly, and sales of the pocket edition, published by S. Fischer Verlag, totaled 900,000. In 1950, the diary was published in France. In 1952, in England and the United States, under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. Now, 20 years after its original publication, the book has been translated into 31 languages, including Bengali, Slovene, and Esperanto. It has been published in 30 countries and has sold more than 1 million copies in hardcover alone. In the United States, the diary and The Works of Anne Frank, both published by Doubleday and Company, have sold well over 150,000 copies and the pocketbook edition of the diary has sold almost 4 million copies. The diary was also distributed by the Teenage Book Club and the Book Find Club, and was reprinted in the Modern Library. It was serialized by an American newspaper syndicate with an estimated audience of 10 million readers, and millions more read it when it was condensed in omnibook and compact magazines. A German translation of the book has been used in the United States as a school reader, and a large type edition has been published by Franklin Watts Incorporated. In 1955, a play by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett based on the diary and called simply The Diary of Anne Frank opened at the Court Theater in New York. A great success, it received the Pulitzer Prize, the Critics' Circle Prize, and the Antoinette Perry Award for 1956. On October 1st, 1956, The Diary of Anne Frank opened simultaneously in 7 German cities. Audiences there greeted it in stunned silence. The play released a wave of emotion that finally broke through the silence with which Germans had treated the Nazi period. For the first time, there were widespread expressions of guilt and shame for what Germans had done to the Jews only a few years before. In Amsterdam, Queen Juliana attended the play's opening on November 27th. This was the city where the events of the play had actually occurred, and many Netherlanders who had lost families and friends in the extermination of the Dutch Jews were in the audience. There were audible sobs, the New York Times correspondent reported, and one strangled cry as the drama struck its climax and conclusion, the sound of the Germans hammering at the door of the hideout. The audience sat in silence for several minutes after the curtain went down, and then rose as the royal party left. There was no applause. In the United States, The Diary of Anne Frank was made into a motion picture in 1959 and adapted for television in 1967. But still, the story wasn't finished. With the passing of the years, more and more details of Anne Frank's life became known. In 1958, Ernst Schnabel published his moving book, for which he interviewed 42 people who had known Anne or whose lives had touched hers. In 1963, a Viennese police inspector, Karl Zilberbauer, was identified as the Gestapo sergeant who had arrested the Franks in 1944. Zilberbauer protested that he had merely followed orders. He was suspended from his post, but was later acquitted of the charge of having concealed his past. In January 1966, the Nazi police chief in the Netherlands during World War II, former SS Lieutenant General Wilhelm Harster, together with 2 former aides, was arrested in Munich. The 3 were charged with having directed the deportation of nearly 100,000 Dutch Jews to Auschwitz. One of their victims had been Anne Frank. At their trial a year later, a former SS major, Wilhelm Zopf, testified that the Franks' betrayer, probably an employee in the warehouse, had received the usual reward of 5 gulden, about $1.40, for each of the persons taken from the secret annex. The German court sentenced Harster to 15 years in prison, his accomplices to 9 years and 5 years. Anne Frank's wish, "I want to go on living even after my death," has come true. Today, the Anne Frank Foundation maintains the building on the Prinsengracht Canal, where the Franks hid for 25 months, as a memorial to Anne Frank. Each year, the house is visited by thousands of people from all over the world. The foundation is also working toward the future by helping to promote better understanding among young people from every part of the world. To this end, it has established the International Youth Center, which serves as a meeting place for young people and which holds lectures, discussions, and conferences covering a wide range of international problems. The Montessori School in Amsterdam is now the Anne Frank School. There are other memorials to her in Germany, Israel, and elsewhere, to atone for the unmarked grave at Belsen. But above all, the diary remains. Her voice was preserved, Ernst Schnabel wrote, out of the millions that were silenced. This voice no louder than a child's whisper. It has outlasted the shouts of the murderers and has soared above the voices of time. This ends the Afterword. You've been listening to Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl, by Anne Frank. Narrated by Susan Adams.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm in tears. I appreciate you guys going through this with me, this being my first time going through the Anne Frank book with students. I didn't think that I would cry at the end. One thing that's been on my heart is that, we feel like we know her, everybody in the world knows her, but she wasn't any more important than any other Jewish child that died during this time, or Jewish person. And I don't think that she would think that she is any more important. She probably wouldn't want to be remembered as more important. It's just that she was able to, during this time, write her thoughts and her feelings and her wishes and her thoughts of the future. And they were preserved. There were lots of things that worked right for this to have been saved. Had she grabbed it as she left, it probably wouldn't have survived. If the SS had decided to take everything out of the warehouse and the office, it wouldn't have survived. So this was meant to have survived, to give us this picture of what life was like for her and for them. I'm still devastated that they didn't survive, and that she had to go through that excruciating ordeal of what she went through. But even at the end, it says that she still didn't think anything bad was happening to her. She was positive until the end. Just an amazing young lady. On page 282, it had said that there were 20 years later, because this book is an older edition, that 1 million copies had been sold and it had been translated in 31 different languages. Well, now over 30 million copies have been sold, and it's been translated into 67 different languages. Part of your short answer on the test on Friday is, why do you think this is such an important book? And I hope that this section kind of helps you with that answer. If you need help with that answer, just let me know, and I'll try not to cry as I explain it to you. But I hope that you guys are moved by this book. I hope that you recall it for the rest of your life, that this is something that stays with you, just in the sense of being positive. God always wants us to be thankful in all circumstances. Paul says in the New Testament that I've been happy when I've had plenty, and I've been happy when I've had nothing. Learn how to be happy, even in those times. Even when he was in prison, he was happy. Because we have God. He's everything that we need, even in an extreme situation like a concentration camp. Whew. So let's go over the answers, and then we can put this to rest. I'm actually going to pull up the answer page for you. So we're going to answer page 100. It looks like this, but I'm going to go ahead and give you guys the answers. Let me scroll down. All right. I'm going to see if I can get as many as I can. So we're starting on number 18. Which protectors were arrested and which were let go? Mr. Kugler and Mr. Kleiman were arrested. Yap and Bepp were let go. I don't know if it was because they were females or they, were not in charge of the office like the men were. Who died in the gas chamber in Auschwitz? Mr. von Don. Number 20, who died in the German evacuation of Auschwitz to that other camp that I can't pronounce? That would be Peter. It was one of those marches where they would just take them and they would walk, and they would literally walk them to death. Number 21, who died in a concentration camp? Again, I'm not going to say that correctly, but number 21, Mr. Dussel. And number 22, who starved to death in Auschwitz-Birkenau? Mrs. Frank. So she stayed there, and then Margot and Anna were taken on a train to Bergen-Belsen. And they knew that they were leaving their mother and father behind. And again, the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was the worst of the worst. It was pretty much abandoned in terms of food and any kind of care that they were getting, and it was just riddled with typhus. Even after the liberation, there were signs out letting all the soldiers know, you need to stay away. Similar to kind of what's going on right now. So Anna and Margot died at Bergen-Belsen, very close together. There is a gravestone, which I'll find pictures of for you guys a little bit later, that has their names on it. They're somewhere in the camp. Nobody knows exactly where they were. Their remains are. The only one to make it out alive was Mr. Frank. And the theme of this novel, and again, if you can probably find another one, but this has been a strong theme even toward the end, when deep down she knew things were getting closer. How much longer can we live through this? The importance of staying positive, even in the worst situations. And I can't imagine anything worse than what they went through. So those are all the answers that you need. So you can go ahead and send in page 99 and page 100. Your final test will be on Friday. You may take the pink test that went home 2 weeks ago in your work, and I'll let you know which ones will be extra credit, or you can do the Kahoot like we had done previously. I will have a PowerPoint game for you guys to play. It was not on the work plan that went home, but I forgot to add that as part of the curriculum that I bought, so that'll be there for you guys. And I may put some other things up just for you guys to look through. I have so many resources that we didn't get to go over in class. So if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with me through email or comments, you can go ahead and do that. Again, this was a big book for us to do, and I thank you guys for doing it with us. And it's hard. So if you want to share, if you want to call me and tell me how much you enjoyed it, or email, I would appreciate it. All right, I will see you guys soon.